Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Author Showcase. I'm Keith Williams, your host. And today we will be talking about some famous African American authors throughout history. The, there's a similar broadcast here in which we talked about some of the most influential African American bloggers and influencers. So today we're going to be talking about some of the famous authors. So real quick, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, there we go. So on today's program, we'll be talking about some of the most influential or famous African American authors. Um, Most of them are originated in the 19th and 20th centuries, but we may find some who African American authors who are famous in the 21st century. Throughout American history, African American authors have represented a rich and diverse body of literature. They contribute fiction and nonfiction novels, short stories, essays, poetry, scholarly articles, academic writing, and everything in between. The narratives they added to the American story have shifted perspectives and created new dialogue around race, culture, politics, religion, and sociology. The stories they have told, both as creative writers and documentarians, entertain, educate, inform, and definitely enlighten us. In many cases, their work go as far as policy, practices, and cultural norms, not to mention shaping how the Black experience is viewed and understood in America. One of the things I do want to point out is that with this so-called discussion of critical race theory, or CTR, CRT for short, what we're seeing here is that, for lack of a better word, they're trying to whitewash American history and trying to make, for example, African American artists of the past and present, irrelevant. And they're trying to say that the stories and the narratives that they bring along with uh, their other books that are written by white authors, they're saying that their works is pretty much dividing America, and they wanted to teach that America is not divisive, it's not racist, but that would be a lie. America has a very painful history, and whether you're African American artist, author, or a Caucasian author, a lot of the stories that they told in these books, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, are very painful, and I believe children and adults should be able, and is highly recommended, that not only that they should learn the good side of American history, but they also should learn about the bad side and the ugly side of American history. So even though they're trying to ban a lot of these books, a lot of these libraries across the country are still encouraging people to just read. Whether a book is banned or not, whether it's written by a white person or a Black person or whoever, we need to learn, we need to know and understand that not all history, is good. And And there are both sides, there are good and bad people on both sides. And we need to know the whole history, the whole story, the whole narrative, whether you agree with it, or not. And so to paint America, as this loving, happy, unified nation, that's just not true. Do not subject your children, to think that way. I believe that everyone should be critical thinkers, and that the stories and the artists that being presented, whether you're black or white, provides, a narrative, a story, a commentary that provokes enlightenment, that provokes critical thinking. And so in order for us to be a well-rounded person, we need to be critical thinkers. Maybe if we are critical thinkers and we actually study the good, the bad, and the ugly about the American narrative, the American story, then perhaps we're able to address some of these most pressing issues. I just want to bring that attention before I continue. In the United States, African American literature originated in the 19th century, mainly with slave narratives. Many told from the perspective of escaped slaves, such as Harriet Jacobs or Frederick Douglass. And see, these are examples of narratives and stories that they don't want your children to know about. They don't want to be taught in public schools. In the 1920s, as Black artists and intellects emerged, following the Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance produced prolific art. Many of these early 20th century works address issues like racism and segregation following the Civil War and Reconstruction era. Again, they're trying to ban these works if they have not already. They don't want your kid to know about these stories. They don't want you to know about these artists. They don't want you to know about these subjects. Some people in America act like that racism and segregation doesn't exist. But the truth of the matter is it does. And who is to better capture these narratives than the people that have been part of the story? Now, how can I tell you something that's going on in a particular situation if I wasn't an eyewitness? So a lot of the artists in the 20th century, particularly African-American artists, when they are authors, when they did their work, most of the issues were centered around racism and segregation. In the middle of the 20th century, Black authors played an important role in laying the foundation for political causes, such as the American Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, the Black nationalism movement. Many feminist authors emerged during that time as well, who put forward ideas about relationships between race, sex, and gender. Many women like Mary Ann Weathers and Audre Lorde had a profound effect on how these subjects were viewed and discussed. Black feminist thinkers established the code of analysis of intersectionality, laying an important foundation for modern feminism. And because of that, the Equal Rights Amendment was a subject at that time, as well as giving the women the right to vote. And in the 70s, their women's rights was expanded to include a women's right to an abortion, which Roe versus Wade obviously have established in 1972-73. So, of course, that had Roe versus Wade, the right for women to decide whether or not they want to have an abortion or not, was dismantled a couple of months ago. And so right now, that is kind of one of the focal points of American society, and it's definitely going to affect the 2022 midterm general election. Following the civil rights movement, African American literature became incorporated into the mainstream as novelists such as Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, who wrote bestsellers, began winning prestige awards. Today, contemporary 21st century writers, including Roxane Gay, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Colson Whitehead, are internal figures in American literature and pop culture. To celebrate some of the accomplishments of these great authors, I now turn your attention to this Stacker webpage, in which they have put together 50 Black writers who had the biggest impact on American life and culture beyond this page. We're going to explore some of these artists. This is Toni Morrison. I'm quite sure that a lot of you know who she is. She, of course, is the first African-American woman to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993 and became the first Black woman to be an editor at Random House. Random House is one of the most popular publishing companies in the country. Her most famous novel is entitled Beloved, which is a story of an escaped enslaved woman who makes the painful decision to kill her daughters to prevent her re-enslavement. Slate columnist Laura Miller wrote of Morrison that she reshaped the landscape of literature with stories that no other novelist, Black or white, have attempted. And I understand that this is definitely a painful story and a painful decision that Toni had to do. That this not, well, she didn't have that that this story portrays that she writes. It gives a dark glimpse of slavery, the realities of what slavery really is about, rather than the narrative that is trying to be discussed. And keep in mind that when Africans was first pulled from dragged from their country to America, this is something that they did not ask for. It was an unwanted migration, and we cannot make it seem like that this is what our ancestors wanted. This is not what our ancestors wanted, but they wanted to be taught in schools that this is what our ancestor wanted, and it's a lie. Okay, we need to stop teaching these lies to our kids, and don't allow them to be closed-minded. When it comes to artists and painting and literature, we have to have an open mind, because everybody does not have the same perspective or the same narrative or the same story. And I believe every story and every narrative should be told in its original truth, so that we can have perspective and open-minded or well-rounded understanding of not only America, but society in general. And so when we talk about African-American artists, they are very known for capturing those things. And if we do that, we can be some of the most critical thinkers in the world. So Toni Morrison, obviously, that's was one of the things that she expressed when she wrote this novel, Beloved. So she was very influential, and her career expands well 40, 50 years. Okay, so our next person, that's her picture, is Anna Cooper. So in the 19th century, it's unheard of that you have a woman, black or white, getting a doctorate. Well, Alice Cooper ended up in getting a doctorate degree from the University of Paris in the 1850s. She was born into slavery, but yet she became the fourth African American woman in history to receive a doctorate degree. She's a Black liberation activist and an early American scholar, and considered to be the mother of Black feminism. Most of her writings is considered to be what's called a feminist intersectionality philosophy. That phrase was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. Cooper's 1892 collection of essays is called A Voice from the South. She was very famous for empowering and uplifting Black women and girls. In this philosophy concept known as feminist intersectionality. So that is Alice Cooper. Okay. Our next person, I'm quite sure you know this person, James Baldwin, is best known for essays on race, class, and sectionality. He is also a novelist. He's a playwright. One of his famous works is called Native Son and I Am Not Your Negro. Native Son, of course, is a story of African American, a poor African American family growing up in Chicago during the Great Depression. And the main character, Bigger Thomas, had a relationship with a white girl from another side of town, which of course is taboo at that time. And he accidentally kills her. So it was an accidental death, and fearing for his life, he pretty much was running from the law. And the results here are not good. Do encourage you to read that book. It has been, there's been several television adaptations of this book as well. It's kind of one of my favorite books, of all time. What a lot of people don't know about James Baldwin is that he was one of the few openly gay Black activists of that era who fought for LGBTQ plus rights alongside the rights of African Americans. The celebrated author penned his first play before he was 11, when his teacher directed it at his elementary school. So he started his career very young. And finally, he was a champion and leading voice during the civil rights movement. So he's a civil rights icon. And a lot of his essays and novels and plays talked about issues that was related to the civil rights movement. the struggles that African Americans, went to. So you very famous playwright, novelist. Okay, the next person we have is Gwendolyn Brooks. You probably have know about her in your American literature books in high school and college. So Gwendolyn Brooks is the first African American to receive a Pulitzer Prize for poetry, particularly in 1949 for her collections of poetry known as Annie Allen. She's also an author. So in this book, called Annie Allen, she details the life of a young Black girl in Chicago as she grows up to become a woman. She's been praised widely for her work because her poems and fiction are so captivating, faithful to the Black experience. Consequently, the nature experience. So even though some of her works were fiction in nature, it really captured the issues and the struggles of African Americans in the middle part and latter part of the 20th century. And next we have Elizabeth Keighley. That's her picture. So Keckler, one of the things that she was famous for is she was a seamstress and personal dresser to First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, and proudly served under President Abraham Lincoln at the White House. She is a former enslaved woman who wrote a memoir entitled Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. The book detailed her time in the White House and was criticized by some for revealing private information about the Lincoln. In addition to her influence around the White House, the author founded an organization called the Contraband Relief Association that provide resources like food, clothing, and housing to free slaves. So in other words, Elizabeth Keighley, I will consider her to be the founder of mutual aid. That's what Contraband Relief Association, that's what they did. They did a lot of mutual aid work for free slaves. What a lot of people, don't know that, even though that Abraham Lincoln had supposedly have freed the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of people consider President Lincoln to be racist, and he did own slaves. And so in his memoirs, Keighley kind of points some of those, things out. It was a highly controversial book, but again, it reveals some of America's true history that some people don't even want your kids to know about. Next, we have, I don't want to go get ahead of myself, and some of these authors, African-American authors that are lesser known than others, but still you need to know about them, such as Robert Abbott. Abbott was a strong political activist, and he wrote a lot of articles in the early 20th century that talked about the political discord, that was going on in America. So this was actually during the time where Jim Crow was in his early years, and that a lot of the rights that African Americans had, today did not exist, back then. And so he, Abbott, was one of the ones that challenged the system. He also founded the Chicago Defender in 1905, which was a weekly Black newspaper that covered issues relevant to African Americans at the time. In his own writings, he told captivating stories and encouraged Black people in the South to migrate to the North. Without Abbott, there would be no Essence, no Jet, no Beauty of the Week, and no Black enterprise, according to Martins Johnson, who wrote an article about him entitled The Undefeated. So about him, all those popular magazines that you like to read, the Essence, the Ebony, the Jet, the Black Enterprise, all of that would not be in existence if it had not been for Robert Abbott. So if you don't know, now you know. Let's move on. Okay, we have Richard Wright, a great, well-known African-American artist. So he's the one that actually wrote the novel Native Son. And he wrote a memoir called Black Boy. Now, going back to, let's go back to James Baldwin. He wrote he wrote a play, Notes of a Native Son, that was based on that novel. Just want to clear that up there. But Richard Wright was the one that actually wrote the novel Native Son. He was one of the most influential African-American novelists known to date. And a lot of these stories that was written by him depicts the real life struggles of African Americans. And he has made a very vital and important contribution to African American literature, especially in the 20th century. Next person we want to bring your attention is Malcolm X. Most of you know Malcolm X to be a strong, staunch African-American activist who was credited for kicking off the Black Power movement. Formerly known as Malcolm Little, he changed his name in prison after joining the Nation of Islam, explaining that he rejected the surname handed down to him by the white slave master. The autobiography of Malcolm X, which he collaborated on with author Alex Haley, was one of the most influential books in the late 20th century American culture, according to cultural historian Howard Bruce Franklin. The vocal Muslim activist who supported the separation of Blacks and whites is sometimes contrasted with Martin Luther King Jr., who advocated for integration. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. So there was kind of like a contrast between philosophy of Dr. Martin Luther King, which he advocated for full integration, while Malcolm X was saying that, we need to be Blacks and whites need to be separate. Next, we have Octavia Butler. She is the first Black woman to write um, in the genre of science fiction. Her book Bloodchild, along with other popular science fiction books, was the first sci-fi writing to ever get a MacArthur Foundation fellowship. Her books contain radical visions of race and power. Her life's work had been a huge impact not only on her genre, but in the way she encouraged and mentored young science fiction writers of color. According to Ayanna Jameson, as she told NBC News in an interview, her legacy is larger than just herself or her individual work, more than anyone probably can imagine right now. So Ayanna Jameson was a protege of Octavia Butler, and in many of her science fiction, writings, race and power was a central figure. And you remember Nichelle Nichols, right? So she's the first African American woman to appear in a science fiction series known as Star Trek, which was on NBC between 1966 and 1969, and spawned a franchise of movies in which Nichelle Nichols also starred. Our next person here is Toni Cade Bambara. Some of her known works include The Salt Enters, Gorilla, My Love, and The Seabirds Are Still Alive. Toni was celebrated for her social consciousness and commitment for making literature accessible. When her book, The Black Woman, came out, for example, that's another book that she has written, she urged her publisher to keep the price affordable so that Black women of all sorts of economic backgrounds could read it. According to Lindsay Ellis, she had created the recipe for Black love and unity as we know it today. So whenever they talk about Black love and unity, you can thank Toni Bambara for that. Next, we have Ta-Nehisi Coates. He is a 21st century African American author. His first book was published in 1908 and became wild in 1908. And in 2015, he wrote a book called Between the World and Me. He became one of the most influential voices among modern African American writers. He gained a following during his years as a writer for The Atlantic and has now written 4 books, as well as the Black Panther comic book series. His work contributes significantly to the current conversations around reparations, systematic racism, and white supremacy. So if you can, please read up on him. He has some great works that are out here. Okay, let's move on. Next person we want to bring to your attention is Frances Harper. That's her picture there. She is the mother of African-American journalists. She had a long career of writing poetry for nearly 50 years before she started, before the critically acclaimed novel Iola Leroy was written in 1892. Harper was a suffrage. She was an abolitionist. Even though she was born as a free person, she also did a lot of work with the Underground Railroad. So she helped a lot of slaves passed on to freedmen of the North. She is also known for refusing to give up her seat on a segregated trolley car 100 years before Rosa Parks became famous for a similar protest in Montgomery for refusing to give her seat. By the way, that's a little known Black history fact for you. Next person we have on the list is James Weldon Johnson, another name that you probably heard of in American literature when you was in high school. He was famous for authoring the autobiography of an ex-color man. He is a prolific poet. He is one of the early leaders of the NAACP. He is a human rights activist and worked as a United States consul under President Theodore Roosevelt and taught literature at Fisk University. Okay, next. Sure, this picture looks familiar to you. Yeah, this is a familiar face. Ida B. Wells, a journalist and an activist who brought attention to the lynchings in the United States in the late 18th and early 19th century. Among numerous pieces of investigative journalism, perhaps the most famous of them all was called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, which exposed many of the cruel and inhumane practices taking place against African Americans during that time period, drawing particular attention to the political and economic motivations behind it. The formerly enslaved woman who was free under the Emancipation Proclamation co-owned the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight newspaper. And Ida B. Wells was, along with James Weldon Johnson, was one of the early founders of the NAACP. Next, we have, hold on. Next, we have Paul Laurence Dunbar, another famous name you probably, I'm sure you heard of in American literature. So so he is a poet and a playwright, and often used what they call Negro dialect or African dialect in a lot of his writing. He wrote the lyrics of the 1903 Indomity, the first all African American Broadway musical. His friend and fellow writer James Weldon Johnson praised his writing. He was the first to rise to a height from which he could take a perspective view of his own writings, said Johnson. He was first to see objectively its humor, its superstition, its shortcomings. The first to feel sympathetically its heart wounds, its yearnings, its aspirations, and to voice them in purely literary. So basically, the whole African American narrative, you can see it in his play. Okay, next we have Langston Hughes, another famous name that you have heard in American literature. So Langston Hughes is one of the founders of the New Negro Movement or the Harlem Renaissance. A novelist, playwright, and poet. He also was a famous columnist for the Chicago Defender He was an early creator of jazz poetry and one of the first African American authors able to successfully earn a living from his writing. 50 years after his death, Hughes' extraordinary lyricism resonated with power to the people, according to David C. Ward for the Smithsonian magazine. So in the 80s and 90s, if you listen to some of the hip hop artists today, you probably notice that a lot of their lyrics are they're prolific, they're insightful, they really tell a story of issues and causes and struggles of African Americans during that particular period. You can thank Langston Hughes for that. Next, we have Ishmael Reed. He is a satirist who called attention to serious issues in American political culture via humor and prology. He also written at least 10 novels and a number of poems, plays, and essays. In the 1960s, Reed co-founded the underground East Village Other and was a member of the Umbra Writers Workshop, which helped launch the Black arts movement. His most famous writing is the 1972 novel, Mumbo Jumbo. So if you ever see those political satire or cartoons that be in the newspapers, Ishmael Reed was the first one to do that. So he's considered to be the father of political satire. In other words, he revolutionized political satire, and a lot of the things that was dealing with politics, he added a little prodigy and a little humor to it. And the reason why he did that is just so that people could fully understand exactly what was going on at that time. Next, we have Maya Angelou, very famous, very prolific. She's the author of 7 autobiographies, along with several books of poetry and essays. Maya Angelou's work had a profound effect on the dialogue around race in America. She was inspired to write her most famous book, I Know Why the Cave Birds Sing, amid a deep depression following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Fellow author James Baldwin, who was a friend, helped her editor persuade her to write it. Also consists of a lot of reverse psychology, as well. She wrote a lot of best-selling novels there of the subject that being taught in high school and college. Okay, next we have Rosa Parks. We just got to talking about her a little bit. Famous activist during the Montgomery Bus boycott. She eventually wrote an autobiography detailing the experience. As I remember, I told you one year, some time ago, 100 years before this has happened, there was another author that had to deal with the same thing. She refused to give her a seat on a car trolley. So Rosa Parks' refusal to give her seat was the point where the American Civil Rights Movement had begun, and she was a strong advocate against American racism. There's a lot of things that she has exposed about it that was mentioned in a lot of her works, including her autobiography. Next, we have Amari Baraka, outspoken author, playwright, and poet who advocated for Black nationalism and Marxism. His impact spread beyond his writings as he launched Harlem's Black arts movement in the 1960s, several decades after the Harlem Renaissance ended. Although undoubtedly influential, he was also a controversial figure, particularly regarding his stance on homosexuality, in which he condemns the behavior. Next, we have James Cone, a pastor theologian who wrote the Black Theology and Black, who wrote the book Black Theology and Black Power in 1969, aligned the philosophies of the Black Power movement within the Black church. He argues that Jesus' message was no different than the political movement, which both advocating for liberalism of the oppressed. So this is kind of like the beginning of what we call today the Black liberation movement or the Black theology movement. All right. Next, we have Lorraine Hansberry, very famous person you probably read about in your in American literature books in high school. Her famous play, A Raisin in the Sun, has a lot of television adaptations, was one of the most important plays ever written about Chicago. Lorraine Hansberry boasts the title of being the first Black playwright to have her script perform on Broadway. Hansberry is the inspiration of Nia Simone's To Be Gifted, To Be Young, Black, Gifted and Black. Okay, again, that's Nia Simone's novel, To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. Okay, so not only did this play, Raising the Sun, was on Broadway, it also has several television adaptations as well. Next, we have Alex Haley, famous for his 1976 novel, Roots, the Saga of an American Family, which became one of the most influential miniseries ever produced, which premiered on ABC on January 30th, 1977. Alex Haley is often credited for kickstarting a wave of interest in genealogy and pride in African roots among Black people in America in the 70s. This is also partially responsible. He is also partially responsible for growing preference at the time of the term African American, according to novelist Charles Johnson. In addition to Roots, Haley also authored the autobiography of Malcolm X, a cynical work in African American literature and political dialogue. So the book also became a miniseries which aired in 1977, followed by two more sequel miniseries, Roots the Next Generation, which talks about, and Roots the Gift. All right. And who we thought that former President Barack Obama would make this list? That's crazy. So we know that he is known for being the 44th president of the United States, but a lot of people don't know that he is a published author as well. Dreams from My Father was published in 1995 before his first Senate campaign. Was a widely acclaimed piece of nonfiction that talks about the modern day American politician. In 2006, Obama wrote The Audacity of Hope, which became a New York Times bestseller. In 2020, he followed up with that with The Promised Land, which focuses on his first his first term as president. It is the first of two planned books. The next will cover his second term. We'll be sure to listen out for that one. But that's cool that former President Barack Obama made this list. All right, let's keep going. We are halfway through. Okay, this is Mary Church Terrell here. She was one of the early pioneers in the women's suffrage movement, and she is also an early civil rights activist. Born in 1863 to free enslaved people, she was one of the first ones to begin the fight for against racial discrimination. As a graduate of Oberlin College, she became one of the first African American women to receive a college degree. In fact, she worked as a journalist for the Washington Post, the Washington Evening Star, and the Chicago Defender under the name Euphemia Kirk. In 1940, she wrote an autobiography known as A Colored Woman in a White World. Do highly recommend that you read that book. Next, we have Frank Marshall Davis, journalist, poet, activist, who have founded the Black Chicago Renaissance. In addition to writing about race and culture, Davis also covered jazz and music history. He was famous in his own right for his many literary accomplishments, though he's often remembered today for his association with former President Barack Obama, who wrote about him in Dreams from My Father. So, yeah, that's pretty cool. I didn't know that. Right. Okay, next we have Roxane Gay. She is a modern writer and feminist. Who is famous in the modern feminist movement today. A 2014 collection of essays entitled Bad Feminists was actually featured as a New York Times bestsellers list. Along with her, so she also did 2 short stories, a novel, and a memoir called Hunger, a memoir of my body. Again, some of her subjects include gender, race, politics, and intersectionality. Okay, next we have W.E.B. Du Bois. Author, civil rights activist who led the Niagara movement, an equal rights organization in the early 20th century, and was a founder of the NAACP. The author, who was the first African American to earn a doctorate degree from Harvard University, is best known for the Black Renaissance, Black Reconstruction in America, a groundbreaking historical narrative that reframed the Reconstruction era and credited Black people with the shaping of their own destiny. Next, we have the wife of the former President Michelle Obama, First Lady Michelle Obama. Just like her husband, she's also a best-selling novelist, writer. She's very famous for her memoirs entitled Becoming, an insightful and deeper personal look on her early years, as well as her time in the White House. This book became a bestseller in 15 days, the shortest time in which a book became a bestseller. On top of her accolades as an author, First Lady Obama has impacted the American public by visiting homeless shelters, advocating for public health campaigns, and championing women's rights. Next, we have William Wells Brown, writer, lecturer, abolitionist, human rights activist, very influential during the 19th century. In addition to his pioneering works as a travel writer, the Escaped Slave was an esteemed playwright, the first African American to be published in several genres. In fact, he also authored an extensive historical account of Black people during the Revolutionary War. Very interesting. Okay, our next person is Sojourner Truth. Abolitionist and women's rights activist, known for her advocacy work. However, she made several notable contributions to the written word, such as the 1950s work titled Narrative. Oliver Gilbert and William Lloyd Garrison, two famous abolitionists during the 1850s, wrote a memoir about her known as The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a Northern Slave. By her powerful speech, shaped the dilation at the time. In 2014, the Soviet magazine featured her on 100 most Americans of all time. Next, we have Booker T. A former slave advisor to the president, had a huge impact during 20th century politics. He was an okay. We got cut off a little bit, but we are almost done. So let's get back to let's get back to our list here. We're talking about some of the most famous African American writers. Next, we have Phyllis Wheatley, first African American to publish a book of poems. The acclaimed poet was born in West Africa in 1753 and sold into slavery as a child. After her enslavers taught her to read and write, she wrote poems about the American Revolution that were later used to support the abolition of slavery. According to Dylan Hartley at Southern Methodist University, he says Wheatley was not alive to see her poetry make a consequential impact on abolition of slavery. But her work was very influential and started the slavery abolition movement. And it also started a movement known as the Great Awakening, which was the foundation of the abolition of slavery. So kudos to her for that. Next, we have Claude McKay. Sure you heard of him. That name sounds familiar in American literature. Poet. Hold on. Okay, he was a Jamaican immigrant, a central figure in the Harlem Renaissance. His famous novel Home to Harlem won a Harman Gold Award for literature. And he's also credited for paving the way for other Black poets. A lot of discussions here, including conditions and racism that was talked about in this poem. Next, we have Toke Shange, modern contemporary poet and playwright. A lot of her topics include race, sexism, and Black power. She is best known for her 1976 play, For Color Girls Who Have Considered Suicide, which won the prestigious Obie Award. On top of her writing accolades, Shange is responsible for creating the Carol poem and coined the term which describes a performance art that blends music and dancing with words. Very interesting. Next, we have Zora Neale Hurston. Okay, so she's famous for her 1937 novel, Their Eyes Are Watching God, but it didn't get literally famous until the 70s during the Black Arts movement. Now, this movie, this novel rather, also saw some light in television and in theatrical film. BBC Arts in 2019 declared that Hurston's novel, Their Eyes Are Watching God, appeared to be on the 100 most influential novel list. She very much had been a part of the Harlem Renaissance, particularly known for artistic and intellectual style of issues and struggles of African Americans during that particular time. So she has a unique way of capturing that story, or those stories, rather. Next, we have Bell Hook. Again, another modern writer. She is actually an early critic of mainstream feminism. Her real name is Gloria Jean Watkins. And a lot of the things that she talked about was racism and sexism. She's the author of more than 30 books and academic articles. Among them are I Ain't a Woman, Black Woman and Feminism. And then you have her memoirs, Bone Girl, Memories of Girlhood, to name to her act. Next, we have on the list is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It is hard to overstate the numerous impact that human rights activist Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had on America's civil rights movement. However, some people are less familiar with his writing. In the 60s, he won a Nobel Peace Prize for pioneering the nonviolence movement of the 60s and was author of several books, including Strive Towards Freedom, The Montgomery Story, and Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos on Commute. Not to mention some of the most famous speeches in history. I Have a Dream, I've Been to the Mountaintop, and let's not forget A Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which was written in 1963. Next, we have Harriet Jacobs, an escaped enslaved person and passionate abolitionist. She is best known for her pioneer autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which she first published in 1861. The book was remarkable for many reasons, one being that it was among the first to discuss the sexual harassment and abuse female slaves had suffered. It was one of the most important slave narratives of its time, according to the New Bedford Historical Society. Next, we have another modern contemporary artist. His name is Colson Whitehead. Highly acclaimed modern writer whose credits including The Underground Railroad in 2016 and The Nickel Boys in 2019. Both of these books, he earned a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. The Pulitzer Committee called The Underground Railroad book, for starters, a smart melting of realism and allegory that combines the violence of slavery and the drama of escape in a myth that speaks to contemporary America. Whitehead is the author of several other novels and 2 nonfiction books as well, many of them which also receive widespread praise. Please, I encourage you to Google him, get more information about him. Very influential in contemporary America, modern America. Next, we have Jessie Redmond Bassett. That's her picture right there. All right. So she's an author, a poet, and a vital part in the Harlem Renaissance. She was a literary editor for the NAACP magazine called The Crisis, as well as the editor for the children's magazine, The Brownie Book. She published 4 novels and provided mentorship to well-known poets such as Claude McKay and Langston Hughes. Numerous historians have called her work and impact on the race dialogue underappreciated. A look at Foster's entire body of work reveals a writer who was more engaged with modern questions of race, class, and gender than she had been given credit. You might want to do some more research on her and read some of her work. I think it would speak for itself. Next, we have Oprah Winfrey. There's a mixed bag, when it comes to her, especially her stance on Christianity, but nevertheless, she has been a great impact of African Americans. She is considered to be the first African American multi-millionaire in North America and the richest African American of the 20th century. And has been called one of the most influential women in the world more than once. Besides her television appearances, her specials, her talk shows, she has also written multiple books, most of them in the self-help genre, inspiring people of all races to live happier, healthier, and more fulfilled lives. She also wrote Journey to Beloved, a collection of journal entries and thoughts that her role as Self in the 1998 adaptation of Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, one of the most influential movies of all time. Next, we have Ralph Ellison, author of the groundbreaking novel The Man, which dealt with issues of African American identity, Black nationalism, and Marxism. Ralph Ellison had a huge impact on American thinking and politics in the 1950s and beyond. According to many scholars, he brought a new type of American character to the page. Let's see what else. So a lot of his works ensued a lot of critical thinking, especially among African Americans, but it also provoked critical thinking among white people as well. So he kind of, so he, kind of, so I guess in other words, a lot of his works was thought provoking to both blacks and whites, and promote a better understanding and hopefully, advocate for critical thinking. Angela Davis is the next person on our list here. A staunch activist, member of the Black Panthers movement, as well as the Communist Party. Is often remembered for associations with a domestic terror attack in California that killed 4 people. She was in that attack. She was charged and prosecuted for purchasing firearms, but was later acquitted by an all-white jury. Her work has contributed mightily to activism around racism and white supremacy. She's written more than 10 books exploring issues such as feminism, women's rights, race, class, and social justice. Next, we have Margaret Walker. Became a vital part of the Chicago Renaissance, Black Renaissance. She was a vibrant figure in the literary community during the 1930s and 40s. Her 1942 poetry collection, For My People, won a prestigious Yale series of younger poets competition. And her 1966 historical novel about the American Civil War entitled Jubilee was also received that award. She is not your average. She is not your average American writer. You could almost hear her voice when she writing these poems, which broke the classic literary tradition, especially among African American writers. Next, we have Frederick Douglass, abolitionist, suffrage. A lot of his writings was in the arena of the political sector, slavery, and abolition. Let's see what else he have. Okay, Douglass is the author of multiple autobiographies, including the 1945 bestseller, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, in 1855's My Bondage and My Free. What a lot of people don't know is that he made a famous speech basically saying that July 4th, the day that America celebrates its independence, is really not for people of color. So he made that perfectly clear. And somehow, from that, we had this conversation about the Juneteenth holiday, as well. So you might well say that Frederick Douglass is the father of Juneteenth. That's being disputed, but in my opinion, I give that credit to Frederick Douglass. Okay. Next, we have Harriet Wilson. She is the first African American to publish a novel in the United States. The book is called Our Neg, and it wasn't until the 1980s that a scholar discovered her identity and credited her with the groundbreaking accomplishment. Oh, that's a long time. We're talking about over 100 years, 160 years that we found out about this work. So you might want to do some research on Harriet Wilson, please. Let's get her out there. Next, we have Barbara Christian, another one of our modern day authors. She is a professor of African American Studies at University of California, Berkeley, the first Black woman to be granted tenure at that university. Has more than 100 articles credited to her. She wrote broadly about race and advocating for literature and academics to be more accessible to women and people of color. In a 2000 New York Times obituary, she was called a leading critical presence in a growing debate over the relationship among class, race, and gender. Now we got two more to go here. Alice Walker. Author of the 1982 Pulitzer Prize novel, The Color Purple, which became a film 3 years later in 1985. In addition to her copious accolades as an author, Walker is a feminist and social activist who is responsible for coining the term womanist. On top of her most famous novel, Walker wrote other works such as The Third Life of Grange Copeland and Marie. And finally, we have August Wilson, an esteemed playwright who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for his series of 10 plays collectively entitled The Pittsburgh Cycle. Each play was set in a different decade and depicted different phases of 20th century American life. The Courier Journal's Betty Bay, speaking to NPR, she says, and called Wilson a miracle of creativity, noted that he was a man so unabashedly in love with Black people, that he is famous for his keenly insightful complexities of African Americans. He clearly became one of the top modern contemporary playwrights in the 20th century. So there you have it. '50 famous Black African American authors. We will continue to have more of these type of segments. In future segments, we'll be talking about African American publishers, African American bloggers. We would also have a segment on those as well. So be sure to stay tuned for that in a future episode of the Author Showcase. Hope you enjoyed this segment here. We do encourage you to read up on these individuals and partake of some of their books. We will continue to be more of an advocate to where we have more African American artists to come on here. That's one thing that we definitely be working on. If it's not for the end of this year, definitely in 2023. So please keep your eye out on this podcast for more information. And until then, thank you so much for tuning in, and keep on reading, keep on striving. Have a good one, everyone.